The sun had barely risen over Coronado when the recruits gathered at the edge of the training field. The salty air from the Pacific drifted across the compound, carried by the morning breeze that always seemed too fresh for the misery ahead. The men were jittery, some bouncing on the balls of their feet, others masking their nerves with smirks and hushed laughter. Today was the first day of another round of Navy SEAL training, the crucible that broke 90% of those who dared to enter. They thought they knew what to expect. The program was legendary for grinding men down to their bare bones, stripping them of bravado, and leaving only those who could endure both pain and humility. Yet when the instructors barked for them to line up, their eyes shifted toward the figure walking briskly across the sand. For the first time, their confidence faltered. She was there. At first glance, she seemed out of place and average height, leanly built woman with her hair tied back, eyes sharp, posture straight. She didn't glance left or right as she approached. Every step was deliberate, as though she had walked this path many times before. The recruits exchanged confused looks, waiting for the punchline. A woman among SEAL trainees? It had to be some kind of mistake. A ripple of murmurs traveled down the line. Some tried to suppress a laugh, others didn't bother. Must be lost. Wrong camp, sweetheart. Hope she brought sunscreen. The whispers were meant to sting, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, her face calm. If she heard them, she didn't care. That composure was unsettling, almost as if she knew something they didn't. The lead instructor, a barrel-chested veteran with a voice like gravel, scanned the recruits. "You think this is funny?" he roared, silencing them instantly. The laughter evaporated, but smirks lingered. They expected the instructor to turn her away, maybe give a speech about mistakes in paperwork. Instead, he said nothing. He simply stepped aside, allowing her to join the formation as though she belonged. The men stiffened, caught off guard. From the corner of his mouth, one recruit muttered, "She won't last a day." Another snorted, "More like an hour." But there she stood, hands behind her back, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the horizon as if she were already elsewhere. The first test began at dawn. The instructors loved starting with chaos. Hit the surf. Came the order, and within seconds, the recruits were sprinting toward the icy waves. The Pacific, cold and unforgiving even in summer, swallowed them whole. Gasps and curses echoed as the chill cut through their bones. Some recruits thrashed wildly, their teeth chattering as they tried to stay afloat. She moved differently. Controlled, efficient, deliberate strokes carried her forward. No wasted energy, no panic. The waves crashed against her, but she cut through them with precision, as though she belonged there. A few recruits noticed, their smugness faltering. Back on shore, they were ordered into the sand for push-ups, endless push-ups that burned shoulders and wrists raw. Sand clung to their sweat, grinding against skin like sandpaper. Groans filled the air. She didn't groan. Her face remained unreadable, her rhythm steady. Where others collapsed, she rose again. By midday, some of the men were already cracking. Muscles trembled, lungs begged for relief, and doubt crept into their minds. She, however, hadn't broken stride. Her calm endurance was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. It wasn't just her physical performance that unsettled them. It was the way she carried herself. When the instructors screamed in their faces, many recruits stammered or averted their eyes. She didn't blink. She stood firm, silent, taking every word without reaction. It was a silence that unnerved the loudest doubters. In the mess hall that evening, whispers returned. They clustered in corners, voices low. "She's tougher than she looks." "Yeah, but it won't last." "Everyone breaks." "She hasn't even complained." A recruit with broad shoulders slammed his tray down and sneered. "Don't be fooled. She's just hiding it." Wait until Hell Week. Then we'll see her crack. But his voice lacked the conviction it had carried that morning. Later, back in the barracks, exhaustion pulled most into uneasy sleep. She, however, sat on the edge of her bunk, boots polished, uniform folded with perfect precision, staring quietly into the darkness. There was no fear in her eyes, no doubt. If anything, there was a strange calm, as though she had already endured worse than anything this camp could throw at her. Some of the men watched her in silence, pretending to sleep but unable to look away. For the first time, they wondered if maybe they had misjudged her. Still, pride is stubborn. In their minds, she was still an intruder, someone who didn't belong in their brotherhood. They had no idea that this so-called intruder wasn't there to prove herself. She was there to evaluate them. The irony was bitter. They saw her as fragile, but she was steel. They saw her as new, but she was seasoned. They saw her as temporary, but she was the one who would decide which of them stayed and which of them went home. The recruits didn't know it yet, but the woman they laughed at was already their commander. And with every silent step, every unbroken stare, she was slowly dismantling their arrogance. The unexpected arrival wasn't a mistake. It was a test. And for most of them, it had already begun. The day had ended the way most first days at Bud ES did, brutally. Salt water still stung their eyes, sand clung to their hair, and muscles screamed with every movement. The recruits stumbled back into the barracks after chow, each man carrying exhaustion like an anchor. For many, just peeling off their wet uniforms felt like climbing another obstacle. The showers became their sanctuary, the one brief moment of comfort after being pushed to the edge. That night, the chatter was louder than usual. First-day nerves were fading, replaced with crude jokes and bragging. The tiled room echoed with laughter, splashing water, and the metallic rattle of soap dispensers. The men reveled in the release, letting their guards down. Then she walked in. The room fell quiet for half a second, a hush of disbelief. A few eyes widened, others narrowed, and then the whispers started. The disbelief quickly curdled into smirks. Well, looks like the camp just got co-ed. Didn't know the Navy was running a daycare. Careful, boys, don't scare her off. The laughter returned, sharper this time, aimed directly at her. Some recruits deliberately made space, not out of respect but mockery, gesturing dramatically as if her presence required ceremony. One even muttered, "Don't drop the soap, sweetheart," earning a round of chuckles. She didn't respond. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. She set down her towel, removed her gear with practiced efficiency, and stepped into the spray without a glance at anyone. Her silence was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment. It was the silence of someone who had already decided their words were beneath her notice. That silence hit harder than any comeback. A tall recruit with a broad chest and tattoos tried again. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too shy?" He grinned at the others, fishing for laughter. They gave it to him, but softer this time. Their voices didn't carry the same easy confidence as before. She ignored him, rinsing sand from her hair, her expression unchanging. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of water. One by one, the recruits realized their jokes were falling flat. They were the only ones laughing, and laughter with no reaction felt hollow. The more she refused to acknowledge them, the more uneasy they became. Finally, another voice piped up from the back. "Maybe she thinks she's better than us." That line drew nods. A few men seized on it, turning their unease into anger. "Yeah, too good to talk, huh? Must be nice, strolling in here like you belong." Still, she said nothing. Instead, she finished, dried off, wrapped her towel with soldierly neatness, and walked out without ever breaking stride. Not once did she meet their eyes. Not once did she give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The door clicked shut behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. The laughter that had once filled the room now felt forced, empty. The recruits looked at each other, half smiling, half uneasy, as though they were trying to convince themselves a mockery had meant something. But in the pit of their stomachs, doubt had already begun to stir. Because deep down, they all recognized something they didn't want to admit. Her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been control. Later that night, the whispers carried into the barracks. She didn't even flinch. Yeah, but that's just nerves. She would break eventually. Maybe. Or maybe she doesn't care about us at all. The last comment hung heavier than the rest. It planted a thought none of them wanted to entertain, that maybe they weren't mocking her. Maybe she was letting them reveal themselves. For the broad-shouldered recruit who had laughed the loudest, the silence festered in his chest. He replayed the scene in his head, searching for the moment she should have cracked, the second where she should have fought back. But there had been nothing. She had been stone unshaken. It was infuriating. He muttered to himself, "She'll crack." They all do. But even he didn't believe it. The instructors, of course, had noticed everything. They always did. In the morning briefing, one of them chuckled darkly. "The boys are rattled already," he said. Another smirked. "Good. Let them dig their own graves. They'll learn fast enough." They weren't referring to her. They knew she didn't need defending. Her role wasn't to be protected, it was to watch, to measure, and to wait. Over the next few days, the showers became an unspoken test. Each night, the recruits eyed her warily when she walked in. Some still muttered under their breath, but the words carried less force. The boldest among them avoided her gaze altogether, suddenly finding the floor tiles fascinating. Her silence never wavered. She went about her routine with the same mechanical calm, never speeding up, never slowing down. Every action was deliberate, as though even the smallest gesture was under her control. And in that silence, something strange began to happen. The jokes dried up. The laughter shrank. And where mockery had once lived, curiosity crept in. Who was she? Why didn't she break? Why didn't she fight back? None of them had answers. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. Because in a world built on bravado, the one person who said nothing was the one they couldn't ignore. By the end of the first week, the showers no longer felt like a place of mockery. Instead, they became a place of unease. No one wanted to admit it, but her presence had shifted the air. Some recruits avoided her completely, showering at different times. Others stole glances, hoping to catch some clue in her expression. They found none. She was a wall. And as each day passed, one truth grew harder to deny. The woman they had laughed at wasn't breaking. She was building something. Not trust. Not yet. But respect. And respect, once planted, only grows. The next morning came cruel and early, as it always did. At 0400 hours, the instructors stormed through the barracks, banging metal trash can lids, screaming like demons risen from the sea. Sleep was not a luxury at Bud S. It was a weapon used against them, withheld until recruits broke. The men rolled out of their bunks groaning, their muscles stiff from the previous day. Sand still clung to their sheets, itching their skin. They stumbled into their boots, some still half asleep, others already dreading what was to come. She, however, rose silently. Her bunk was already made with hospital corner precision, boots polished, uniform crisp. While the others scrambled, she stood ready, as if she had never needed sleep at all. The instructors barked them outside into the biting pre-dawn air. A cruel wind swept off the Pacific, cutting through their thin uniforms. The sky was still black, the moon hanging like a silver coin above the water. hit the surf. An instructor roared. Without hesitation, the recruits sprinted toward the ocean. The cold was immediate and brutal. The water clawed at their skin, numbing fingers and toes within seconds. Shouts of pain filled the air raw, animal sounds that betrayed weakness. She dove in without a sound. Her strokes were long and efficient, cutting through the waves with practiced rhythm. The men beside her gasped and flailed, but she moved as though she belonged there, as though the Pacific itself had been her training ground. By the time the order came to return to shore, some recruits were already shivering uncontrollably. Their lips were blue, their teeth rattling like castanets. They stumbled onto the sand, collapsing in heaps. "Get wet, get sandy," the instructors barked. The recruits obeyed, rolling in the coarse sand until it coated their soaked uniforms. The grit stuck to their skin, biting into every crease and fold. "Push-ups, now!" Dozens of bodies dropped to the ground, the sand grinding into raw flesh with every repetition. Arms trembled, shoulders burned, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on them like a lead blanket. She moved with steady rhythm. Down, up, down, up. Her face betrayed nothing. Where others grimaced in pain, her expression was carved from stone. She did not groan. She did not falter. One recruit collapsed face first into the sand, gasping. Another rolled onto his back, clutching his chest, shaking his head. The instructors were merciless. "Quit now if you can't hack it. Ring the bell and save us the trouble." But she did not stop. Her silence was louder than the shouting around her. By mid-morning, the real test began, the obstacle course. A half-mile stretch of wooden beams, ropes, and walls stood before them like a gauntlet from hell. Every SEAL candidate knew this course. It was infamous for separating the strong from the weak. The first obstacle was a 30-foot cargo net. Recruits scrambled upward, fingers slipping on wet rope, boots searching for purchase. Some froze halfway up, paralyzed by height. She climbed steadily, hand over hand, never looking down. Her movements were precise, efficient, no wasted energy. At the top, where others hesitated, she swung over with ease, descending as though she'd done it 1,000 times before. Next came the rope swing across a water pit. One recruit slipped, crashing into the muddy pool below. Another misjudged the swing and slammed hard into the far wall, sliding down in pain. She launched forward with perfect timing, landing cleanly on the other side. Not a sound escaped her lips. As the course wore on, the gap widened. By the halfway point, several men had fallen behind, gasping for breath, their faces pale. She remained near the front, her pace unbroken. The recruits who had once mocked her now exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just that she was keeping up, she was outpacing many of them. Her endurance was a quiet accusation, a reminder of their arrogance. By noon, the sun blazed overhead. Sweat mixed with sand, turning uniforms into abrasive weights. The instructors weren't done. Log PT. They roared. 6-man teams lifted massive wooden logs onto their shoulders, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. The weight crushed down, grinding bone against muscle. Recruits staggered, some nearly collapsing under the burden. She was assigned to a team of doubters, the same men who had laughed the loudest in the showers. They exchanged smirks, thinking this would be her breaking point. But when the log dropped onto their shoulders, something unexpected happened. She took the lead. Her stance was steady, her shoulders squared, her breathing controlled. While others groaned, she adjusted her grip, carrying more weight than her share. "Step, together. Step," she said firmly, her voice calm but commanding. The team obeyed, almost without realizing it. Her rhythm steadied them, her composure anchored them. The smirks faded, replaced by stunned silence. By the end of the drill, It was clear who had held the team together. And it wasn't the broad-shouldered recruit who had mocked her. It was the woman they had underestimated. Hours blurred into pain. They ran miles with boats on their heads, the sharp edges digging into their skulls. They crawled through mud under barbed wire. They carried each other on their backs until their legs buckled. And through it all, she never faltered. Even when her arms shook, even when her legs burned, her face remained calm. She didn't seek pity. She didn't seek praise. She simply endured. By sunset, the recruits were broken shells of themselves. Some had already rung the bell, quitting before the first week was done. Others collapsed in the sand, their bodies refusing to move. She stood tall. Her uniform was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, sand clinging to every inch of her skin. But her eyes were steady, her breathing controlled. She looked less like a trainee and more like a sentinel, someone who had come not to prove herself, but to test everyone else. The recruits who had laughed at her in the showers now avoided her gaze. They couldn't reconcile what they had seen. She hadn't just survived the day. She had mastered it. And though none of them would admit it out loud, a dangerous thought was creeping into their minds. She was stronger than most of them. And maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than all of them. The first week had ended, though calling it a week felt dishonest. Time at Bud S was distorted days bled into nights, pain blurred into exhaustion, and the only constants were the instructor's screams and the ocean's merciless pull. For most recruits, just making it this far was a minor miracle. For her, it was simply the beginning. The men had noticed. Whispers spread through the barracks like smoke after a fire. The jokes that once came easily now carried hesitation. Laughter had dulled, replaced by quiet exchanges. She doesn't talk much, does she? Doesn't need to. She just does it. Yeah, but anyone can push through for a week. Wait till Hell Week. Then we'll see. They wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it. Because the alternative, that she was genuinely stronger, sharper, and steadier than them, was too much to swallow. But doubt is a parasite. Once it finds a crack, it spreads. That Monday morning began with tactical exercises on the beach. The recruits were divided into squads and handed maps with grid coordinates. Their task: locate a hidden cache buried in the dunes before the timer ran out. The instructors gave no further details. That was the point: figure it out under pressure, or fail. Most teams charged ahead recklessly, their leaders barking orders without strategy. Sand sprayed beneath their boots as they ran in circles, misreading compass bearings, arguing over directions. Her team hesitated, waiting for her to move. She knelt in the sand instead, studying the map with an intensity that silenced the air around her. Her fingers traced the grid lines, her eyes scanning the horizon. West by northwest, she murmured, almost to herself. Then louder, follow me. There was no debate. Her voice carried certainty, the kind that brooked no argument. The team followed, half out of obedience, half out of curiosity. She led them not by speed, but by precision. Each step was measured, each adjustment deliberate. Where others stumbled into dunes and doubled back in confusion, she guided her squad in a straight, unwavering line. They found the cache first. The instructors offered no praise. They never did. But the recruits noticed. They noticed the way she had read the terrain, the way she had cut through the fog of panic with cold, clear logic. One of the men muttered under his breath, "No way, she just guessed that." Another replied, quieter still, "She didn't. She knew." That wasn't the only exercise where her brilliance showed. During a mock ambush drill, recruits were tasked to defend a position against instructors playing the role of aggressors. Chaos erupted instantly. Men shouted over each other, firing blanks wildly, ducking for cover in disorganized clumps. She was different. She crouched low, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. While others wasted ammunition, she tracked movement, calling out positions with startling accuracy. Left flank, 20 yards. Watch the ridge. Move now. Her squad reacted instinctively. They shifted, adjusted, and suddenly their defense wasn't collapsing, it was holding. The instructors, known for dismantling recruits with ease, found themselves slowed, then stalled. By the end of the drill, her squad stood where others had fallen apart. When the whistle blew, the men in her team looked at her with something new in their eyes. Not annoyance, not mockery, respect. It was subtle, unspoken, but it was there. Not everyone accepted it. Pride dies hard, especially in men who had built their lives on being the strongest in the room. One night in the barracks, the broad-shouldered recruit, the same one who had mocked her in the showers, leaned forward on his bunk, voice low but sharp. "She's not better than us. She just got lucky today." Another shook his head. "Lucky doesn't win 2 drills in a row. She's just hiding weakness," the broad-shouldered man insisted. "No one can keep this up." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen it too, the way she moved, the way she commanded, the way she never flinched. Deep down, he knew she wasn't hiding anything. She was revealing it. As the days wore on, her presence became impossible to ignore. During log PT, when a teammate stumbled, she shifted the weight onto her own shoulder without complaint, steadying the rhythm until the group regained footing. During a navigation exercise, when another squad panicked after losing their compass, she lent them direction, guiding them toward the objective without hesitation, even though she wasn't required to help. It wasn't just her strength. It was her awareness. Her ability to see more than the task at hand, to notice the cracks in others before they broke. The recruits began to exchange glances when she walked by. Not mocking glances, but wary ones. They didn't speak it aloud, but the thought lingered. She sees everything. One night, after another brutal day of drills, the barracks lay quiet. Exhausted men sprawled in their bunks, some asleep, others too sore to rest. She sat at her desk, cleaning her gear with slow, deliberate movements. The lamplight caught the sharp lines of her face, the unwavering steadiness in her eyes. A younger recruit across the room finally spoke. His voice was tentative, hesitant. "How do you do it?" The room stirred, ears tuning in. She didn't look up. "Do what?" "Never complain. Never break. You just keep going." Her hands paused only for a moment before resuming. Complaining wastes energy. Breaking isn't an option. Keep going, or you don't. The recruits absorbed her words in silence. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't motivational. It was a truth, plain and heavy, carved from experience. The younger man nodded slowly, lying back in his bunk. The others didn't respond, but the weight of her words hung in the air long after the lights went out. By the end of the second week, doubt had spread further. The men still whispered in corners, still told themselves she'd eventually fail, but their certainty was gone. Where there had once been laughter, now there was unease. Because each day she didn't break was another reminder that they had underestimated her. And each time she succeeded, they couldn't help but ask themselves a dangerous question. If she wasn't failing, what did that mean for them? For the first time, the recruits weren't doubting her. They were doubting themselves. And in SEAL training, that was the first step toward breaking. The third week of training was when most recruits cracked. The instructors knew it, the veterans remembered it, and the rookies feared it. By then, the physical pain had become constant, but worse than the pain was the exhaustion. 3 hours of sleep a night, endless miles run in boots that tore skin raw. The Pacific's icy grip dragging warmth out of their bones. It was enough to turn even the strongest into ghosts of themselves. That morning, the instructors gathered them at the edge of the compound. The recruits stood in formation, swaying slightly, eyes bloodshot, shoulders slumped. The instructors paced in front of them like wolves circling prey. "Today," one of them barked, "we find out who belongs here and who doesn't. Today, we separate the men from the quitters." His voice sharpened. "And most of you? You're quitters." The recruits clenched their jaws. Some looked away. Others stared at the ground. The instructor pointed to the horizon, where smoke rose faintly in the distance. "Out there is your mission. You will infiltrate, secure the compound, and extract your objective. You will be under fire. You will be hunted. And you will fail unless you act like a team." The recruits exchanged nervous glances. A mission simulation. Everyone had heard about them legendary for breaking squads apart, exposing weaknesses faster than any lecture or drill. The instructors gave no further instructions. That was the test. They set out across the dunes, rifles slung, packs heavy, the sun beating down on their necks. The Pacific wind offered no comfort. It was hot, sharp, filled with the taste of salt and sand. At first, they moved together, but exhaustion gnawed at discipline. Their formation stretched thin, men straggling at the back. The broad-shouldered recruit, who had once mocked her the loudest, stumbled, his breath ragged. Another snapped at him to keep up. Tension was already rising when the first shots cracked. Blank rounds whistled overhead, instructors hidden in the dunes firing mercilessly. The recruits dove for cover, sand exploding around them. Chaos erupted. "Left, left!" One man screamed. "No, right? They're on the ridge." Another shouted back. "Move forward. Fall back." Orders clashed. Confusion reigned. Recruits scrambled in opposite directions, colliding, shouting, panicking. Their mission was collapsing within minutes. She moved differently. While the others shouted, she stayed silent, scanning the ridges with razor-sharp eyes. Her breathing was steady, her movements controlled. She tracked muzzle flashes, calculated angles, traced the rhythm of fire. Then, when the panic reached its peak, she stood. "Cover fire left ridge." She barked, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The recruits froze. The authority in her tone was undeniable. They obeyed without thinking, unleashing a volley of blanks toward the ridge. "Second squad, flank right, now," she commanded, pointing sharply. Her arm didn't waver. Men who had been stumbling a second earlier moved with sudden purpose. They spread out, taking positions exactly where she directed. "Advance. Low crawl. Keep your rifles up." The recruits obeyed. For the first time, their movements weren't chaos. They were coordinated. The instructors intensified the assault. Explosions of smoke and sound thundered across the dunes. Shots cracked closer. An explosion sent one recruit tumbling, his pack flying. He curled into the sand, paralyzed with fear. She was already moving. "On your feet," she snapped, hauling him up by his harness. Her strength startled him. It wasn't just physical. It was force of will. Her eyes locked on his. "Move," and he did. Step by step, order returned. She directed fire teams with clipped precision, shifting them like chess pieces. "Suppress that bunker. Hold this line. You cover their advance." Every command was immediate, sharp, unshakable. The men stopped questioning. They stopped arguing. They simply followed. And under her command, they advanced. Within minutes, the enemy positions fell silent. The recruits pushed into the compound, clearing rooms with efficiency they hadn't known they possessed. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the whistle blew. Mission complete. The recruits collapsed into the sand, chests heaving, lungs burning. Sweat and grit streaked their faces. For a long moment, no one spoke. They knew what had just happened. They had been seconds from total collapse, ready to fail spectacularly in front of their instructors. And then she had stepped in. Not with panic, not with hesitation, but with command. Not a single recruit had resisted her. Not a single man had questioned her orders. They had followed because, in that moment, they had no choice. Her authority had been absolute, and it had worked. The broad-shouldered recruit sat hunched, staring at the sand. His hands trembled, though he tried to hide it. He remembered the showers, the jokes, the laughter. He remembered mocking her, dismissing her, certain she was weak. But when the bullets had flown, and the mission had unraveled, she had been the one who saved them. Not him, her. The instructors gathered the recruits afterward, eyes cold, expressions unreadable. One of them asked, "Who was in charge out there?" Silence. No one spoke. They glanced at each other nervously, none daring to answer. Finally, the instructor's gaze landed on her. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, as if he already knew. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. The recruits shifted uneasily. They understood. She had led them, and not one of them had stopped her. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Exhaustion hung over the room like fog, but beneath it was something else, tension. Some recruits lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the mission in their heads. They remembered the chaos, the fear, the helplessness. And then they remembered her voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise. Others glanced at her from their bunks. She sat at her desk again, methodically cleaning her rifle, as though nothing unusual had happened. To her, it had been routine. To them, it had been revelation. Finally, the younger recruit who had once asked her how she never broke, whispered into the darkness, "You saved us today." Her hands paused briefly, and resumed their work. "No," she said calmly. "You saved yourselves. I just reminded you how." The room fell silent again. But in their hearts, they knew it wasn't true. She had led them. And for the first time, they weren't just doubting themselves. They were beginning to believe in her. That day was remembered differently by each man. Some recalled the chaos, the fear of failure. Others remembered the whistle, the relief of survival. But all of them, without exception, remembered the moment she stood tall in the storm, voice like steel, and turned panic into order. It was the breaking point, when the men realized their arrogance had shattered, and something else had taken its place. Respect. And respect, once given, is not easily taken back. The weeks had ground them down to shadows of who they once were. Faces gaunt, uniforms ragged, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Yet something had shifted among the recruits. They no longer laughed at her. They no longer questioned her presence. Instead, they watched her every movement, every command, every quiet act of resilience. Some copied her habits, the way she wrapped her boots to prevent blisters, the way she rationed her energy on runs, the way she cleaned her rifle at night with patient care. Even the broad-shouldered recruit, once her loudest critic, now carried a silence around her. He didn't look at her with mockery anymore. He looked at her with something closer to unease. Because each day, it became clearer, she wasn't just enduring training. She was shaping it. And that terrified them. The reveal came on a morning that started like any other. The Pacific wind was sharp, the sand damp from midnight tide. The recruits stood in formation, chests heaving from a pre-dawn run that had pushed them beyond exhaustion. The instructors, as always, prowled in front of them like predators, scanning for weakness. Then, one instructor stopped abruptly. He studied the line of battered recruits before barking. "Today, You meet your commander. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Commander? None of them spoke, but questions burned in their minds. Commanders didn't mingle with recruits. Commanders were distant figures, men you saw only in briefings or on plaques in the hallway. Whoever this was, their presence was rare and important. The recruits straightened despite their fatigue, trying to look sharper, tougher, worthy of attention. The instructor stepped aside, and she walked forward. For a moment, no one moved. She didn't look different. She wore the same fatigues, the same boots caked with mud, the same rifle slung across her shoulder. Sweat streaked her face. Her hands were raw. She was one of them. But as she stopped in front of the formation, as she turned to face them with steady eyes, the weight of the moment settled like thunder. The instructor's voice rang out, sharp and merciless. Recruits, meet your commander. He paused, savoring the silence. Then, Commander of the SEALs. Gasps broke the formation. Heads whipped toward her, disbelief etched on every face. For weeks, they had called her weak, mocked her, dismissed her, and all along, she had been their commander. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The broad-shouldered recruit's jaw went slack. His fists clenched at his sides, his mind scrambling to reconcile the truth. He remembered every cruel word, every laugh, every sneer. Now those moments burned like acid. The younger recruit, the one who had once whispered questions in the dark, stared at her with wide eyes, not of disbelief, but of awe. And the others? Their arrogance shattered. Their pride crumbled. What replaced it was something rawer, sharper, and infinitely more powerful. Respect. She stood there, unflinching, her expression calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. Her very presence said enough. I led you here, she said finally, her voice steady, carrying across the stunned formation. And I will continue to lead you. But leadership is not about shouting orders or demanding obedience. She let her gaze sweep across them. It's about example, about endurance, about proving every single day that the mission matters more than you do. Her words cut deeper than any insult ever had, because they were true. The men had seen it in her every late-night cleaning session, every shoulder she offered under the weight of the log, every command she gave in chaos that had saved them from failure. She hadn't just told them what leadership looked like. She had shown them. One of the instructors stepped forward, his face grim. This wasn't an accident. You were tested, all of you. Tested to see if you would mock, doubt, or follow. And she? He nodded at her. She showed you what a true commander is. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, shame gnawing at their insides. They had failed the test, not in endurance, not in tactics, but in judgment. They had underestimated her. And now, standing in front of them, she wasn't just a fellow trainee. She was the standard. The broad-shouldered recruit finally broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, but clear. Ma'am. He paused, swallowed hard, then forced the words out. Permission to apologize. The instructors raised their brows. The recruits turned. She studied him for a long moment. Her face was unreadable. Then, finally, she shook her head. No, the word hit harder than any reprimand. The broad-shouldered recruit blinked, stunned. You don't apologize to me, she said firmly. You prove me wrong. Out there, every day. You fight harder, run faster, push longer not because I expect it, but because you owe it to the man next to you. Her gaze swept the ranks. That's how you earn respect. Not with words, with action. The recruits lowered their eyes, chastened. And for the first time since the beginning of training, none of them doubted her. Later that night, the barracks buzzed with quiet conversation. No one laughed. No one mocked. The usual banter had been replaced by reflection, by whispered admissions of guilt, by grudging admiration. "She's been leading us all along," one said. "She carried us when we couldn't carry ourselves," another added. "And we treated her like she didn't belong." The weight of their arrogance pressed heavy on their shoulders. But beneath it, something new flickered resolve. If she could endure as their commander, then they could endure as her team. She sat at her desk again, the lamplight glowing faintly over her steady hands as she cleaned her gear. This time, though, she wasn't alone. The younger recruit approached quietly, rifle in hand. He sat beside her, mirroring her movements. Slowly, others joined, until half the squad was seated around her, rifles laid out, hands working in rhythm. No words were exchanged. None were needed. It wasn't submission. It wasn't apology. It was unity. And in that silence, in that quiet circle of men who had once doubted her, something unbreakable was forged. The next morning, when the instructors barked them awake and sent them running into the surf, the recruits no longer dragged their feet. They carried the weight together. They shouted louder. They pushed harder. They moved as one. Because now, they weren't just a group of men enduring the hell of training. They were a team. And at their head, steady as the tide, was the one they had laughed at in the showers, now revealed not just as their equal, but as their commander. For the recruits, the reveal was a moment burned into memory, a scar of shame and a spark of pride. For her, it was something else. It was the moment they finally understood what she had known all along. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And now it was hers. The reveal had changed everything. Before, she had been a question mark in their minds, an outlier, an anomaly, someone they didn't understand and didn't want to accept. Now there was no question left. She wasn't just another trainee, struggling through the mud beside them. She was their commander. But respect isn't automatic, even with a title. Respect in the SEALs was forged in the crucible of sweat, blood, and suffering. And though they had mocked her once, now they were determined to prove themselves worthy of her. It wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about survival. The change showed itself the very next morning. They were on the beach before sunrise, standing in formation as the instructors barked orders. The sky was still black, the air sharp with salt, the waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. The men's bodies screamed in protest, every muscle frayed, but for the first time, they didn't stagger into the surf reluctantly. They charged. The instructors roared commands. Push-ups in the water. Hold your rifles high. Before, the recruits would have grumbled, shifted, found excuses. Now, they moved as one synchronized, unhesitating, shouting over the roar of the surf. Hoo-ya! The sound rolled across the beach, deep and thunderous, startling even the instructors. At the center of it all was her. She didn't yell louder than the others. She didn't grandstand. She simply held her ground, her rifle high, her body steady against the tide. And the men mirrored her. The broad-shouldered recruit, once the loudest in mocking her, now bared his teeth in a grim smile as the waves slammed against him. Every time his arms threatened to drop, he stole a glance at her, saw her unflinching posture, and forced himself to endure. If she could hold, so could he. The unity spread beyond the beach. During runs, where once men fell behind and cursed their weakness, the squad now closed ranks. If one stumbled, another grabbed his harness and pulled him forward. If someone gasped for breath, another offered words to keep him moving. It wasn't softness, it was survival. And it was her influence. Because she never left a man behind. During log PT, when the beam of wood pressed down on their shoulders, she was the one who counted cadence, her voice calm but relentless. 1, 2, 3, 4. The recruits shouted with her, voices melding into a rhythm that drowned out the pain. They no longer fought against the weight as individuals. They bore it as a single, unbreakable unit. Even the instructors noticed. One leaned toward another, muttering under his breath. "They're tighter than most squads this early." The other smirked. Not most squads. Her squad. But the true test of their unity came in a drill designed to break even the strongest. It began at midnight. Sirens blared through the compound, jerking the recruits from their bunks. Instructors stormed the barracks, bellowing, "Gear up! You're under attack." The men scrambled, pulling on boots, strapping on packs, clutching rifles. Within minutes, they were running across the dunes, guided only by red flares and shouted orders. The scenario was brutal. Defend a mock compound against wave after wave of assault. Smoke grenades filled the air. Blank rounds cracked in the dark. Instructors advanced with ruthless precision. The recruits panicked at first, the chaos threatening to tear them apart. But then her voice cut through the noise. "Hold the line, dig in. Suppress that fire now." They obeyed without hesitation. She moved through the darkness like she had been born in it, calm, decisive, her commands sharp as blades. She positioned men on the flanks, shifted their fire patterns, pulled the wounded back into cover. At one point, the broad-shouldered recruit stumbled, tripping over debris as blanks snapped overhead. She was there in an instant, hauling him up by the harness, just as she had done for another weeks before. "On your feet, sailor," she snapped. "We don't fall here." And he rose, teeth clenched, fighting harder than he ever had. The recruits held the compound for hours long past the point where their bodies begged to quit, long past the moment where fear might have broken them. When the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the drill, they collapsed in the sand, drenched in sweat, lungs burning, but victorious. And for the first time, they didn't look to the instructors for validation. They looked to her. That night, the barracks was alive with quiet energy. No one spoke of her as the girl anymore. No one doubted her presence. Instead, they swapped stories of her commands during the drill, the way she had turned chaos into order, the way she had saved them from failure. "She doesn't just lead," one recruit muttered. "She makes you believe you can go further than you think." The younger recruit, lying back on his bunk, whispered, "That's what a commander does?" The broad-shouldered recruit, silent for weeks, finally nodded. His voice was low, but firm. "She's ours." The room fell quiet, but the sentiment lingered in the air like a vow. The next day, their transformation was undeniable. During navigation drills, they moved like a machine, efficient, precise, covering each other without needing to be told. During swims, where panic once threatened to drown the weaker men, they linked arms, steadying each other against the current. During runs, they shouted chants in unison, their voices carrying across the beach, echoing off the waves. Even the instructors, masters of breaking men down, found themselves impressed. "They're not just surviving," one muttered. "They're thriving." And at the heart of it all, she remained the same calm, steady, unflinching. Her leadership wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was relentless consistency, the kind that demanded respect not through words, but through example. The men followed her not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Because under her command, they weren't just recruits anymore. They were a team. Weeks later, when another simulation nearly ended in disaster, their unity was tested again. They were tasked with rescuing a downed pilot behind enemy lines. The mission was grueling long marches through soft sand, timed objectives that seemed impossible, instructors ambushing them at every turn. Halfway through, exhaustion threatened to tear them apart. Packs grew heavier, steps slowed, tempers flared. But then, she knelt beside the mock pilot, a 50-pound dummy, strapped to a stretcher, and lifted it onto her shoulders without hesitation. "If I can carry him, you can carry yourselves," she said simply. And they did. One by one, the recruits pushed forward, matching her pace, refusing to falter. Together, they hauled the pilot across the finish line, collapsing in the sand as the whistle blew. The instructors said nothing. They didn't need to. The recruits already knew. They had become something rare, something unbreakable. And it was because of her. In the quiet moments after, as the squad sat around her in the barracks, polishing rifles and sharing exhausted smiles, the younger recruit finally said aloud what they had all been thinking. "You're not just our commander," he murmured. "You're our anchor." She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because they all knew it was true. And under her command, they no longer feared the weeks ahead. They welcomed them. The final week of training arrived like a storm. By then, the recruits had endured the impossible Hell Week. Night raids, endless swims, grueling marches with packs that cut into their shoulders. They were leaner, harder, stripped to their cores. But more than their bodies, their pride had been reshaped. The men who once laughed at her no longer saw her as a curiosity or an outsider. She wasn't just a teammate, wasn't just a commander. She had become the heartbeat of the unit. And now, as graduation loomed, the instructors prepared one final trial and endurance march designed to push them past even their rebuilt limits. They stepped off before dawn, the horizon only a thin line of gray. Packs loaded, rifles slung, boots sinking into soft sand. The air was cold, the kind that bit deep into the lungs. The march stretched for miles through dunes, across jagged rocks, into the biting surf, and back again. Hours blurred. Sweat mixed with salt water, boots filled with grit. Blisters tore open, muscles screamed, and minds frayed. Men faltered. Some stumbled, others collapsed outright. But this time, no one was left behind. When one slowed, another grabbed his pack. When one fell, two more lifted him. And at the center of it all, she carried not just her weight, but often theirs. At one point, she hoisted a staggering recruit's rifle across her own shoulders, her jaw set with unshakable determination. Her voice carried down the line, steady, unwavering. One step at a time. Keep moving. The words weren't loud. They weren't shouted like an instructor's bark. But they carried farther than any scream, because they came from someone who had bled beside them, someone who had carried more than her share and never complained. And so they moved. Step after step. Mile after mile. By the time the march ended, the recruits collapsed in the sand at the compound's edge. The instructors blew the whistle, their eyes scanning the battered line of men. Every single one had finished. It was rare, almost unheard of. But this class had done it because she had led them. Graduation came days later. The recruits stood tall, shoulders squared, uniforms pressed, though their bodies bore the scars of training scabbed knuckles, bandaged feet, bruises that hadn't yet faded. They were no longer the same men who had stumbled into the showers, laughing at a woman in their ranks. They were warriors. The commander of the program addressed them, his voice booming across the field. Most who attempt this training never see this day. You endured. You fought. You proved you belong. He paused, his eyes sweeping the line. But more than that, you learned what it means to be brothers. To put the mission above yourself. To trust the one beside you. The recruits stood taller, pride burning in their chests. And then he gestured to her. Your class had something rare, someone who reminded you of what true leadership looks like. Not rank, not power. Example. The men turned their heads toward her. She stood in formation like the rest, eyes forward, shoulders steady. But in their hearts, they knew she was different. She hadn't just passed the course. She had changed it. After the ceremony, as families reunited, the recruits gathered around her. No one spoke at first. There was too much to say, and no words seemed enough. Finally, the broad-shouldered recruit, who had once mocked her more than anyone, stepped forward. His voice was thick, rough. "You made me better. We all know it. Without you, I wouldn't have finished." He swallowed hard. "None of us would have." She studied him quietly, then nodded once. "You finished because you chose not to quit. Don't ever forget that." The others stepped closer, forming a circle around her. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no formal acknowledgement. But in that silent gathering, something more powerful was forged. Not just respect, loyalty. In the years that followed, those men carried her lessons into every corner of their lives. Some deployed to distant battlefields, where they relied on the calm under fire she had drilled into them. Some became leaders themselves, remembering her example when their own men faltered. Others carried her words home, teaching their families, their communities, that strength wasn't arrogance. It was endurance, unity, sacrifice. And whenever they met again, years later, one story always resurfaced. The story of how they had laughed at her in the showers, mocking, blind, foolish. And how, piece by piece, she had dismantled their doubt. How she had stood in the storm, unshaken. How she had led them through fire. How she had revealed herself, not just as their equal, but as their commander. They told that story with pride, not because it flattered them, but because it reminded them of their own transformation. Because in doubting her, they had doubted themselves. And in following her, they had found their strength. For her, it was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving what was possible. She knew there would always be doubters inside the SEALs, outside, anywhere she went. People who would look at her and see only what she wasn't. But she also knew this. Leadership wasn't about silencing doubt. It was about walking through it, again and again, until the truth could no longer be denied. And she had done exactly that. Years later, new recruits would whisper her story during their own training. They laughed at her in the showers. Yeah, but then they found out she was the commander. It became legend, told not just as a warning against arrogance, but as a lesson in respect, resilience, and the quiet power of leading by example. And in that legend, her legacy lived on. Not just as the first woman to command SEALs, not just as the one who endured when others quit, but as the leader who taught them the hardest truth of all. Respect isn't given. It's earned 1 mile, 1 mission, 1 unshakable step at a time. The waves still crashed against the Pacific shore where it had all begun. The sand still burned under the sun. The wind still tore at the compound like it always had. But for the men who had stood beside her, who had doubted her, mocked her, and finally followed her, that place would never be the same. Because it was there, in the mud, the surf, the endless grind, that they had witnessed something unforgettable. Not the breaking of a woman, but the forging of a commander. And the legacy she left behind was not just in medals or titles. It was in the men who carried her lessons into every battle, every mission, every moment of their lives. A legacy not born of arrogance or power, but of endurance, of unity, of respect, forged forever in the fire of the SEALs.